The tires screamed against concrete like the damned crying out for salvation. Kandahar Air Base, August 18th, 2012. The sun hung low and merciless over the Afghan desert, painting everything the color of dried blood. And there, limping out of the sky like a wounded bird refusing to fall, came an A-10 Thunderbolt that had no earthly right to still be flying. The left wing was gone, not damaged, gone. The tail section looked like it had been chewed by something with teeth made of shrapnel in rage. Smoke poured from where an engine used to be, trailing behind the aircraft like the ghost it had become. The landing gear descended with a mechanical groan that sounded almost human, almost pleading. On the tarmac, fire crews stood frozen. Medics gripped their kits with white knuckles. 300 souls held their breath as one. The Warthog touched down hard, too hard. The right tire exploded on impact, shredding rubber across the runway in a spray of black confetti. The aircraft lurched sideways, then caught itself with the stubbornness of something that refused to quit. Metal scraped concrete. Sparks showered upward like offerings to a god of war who'd finally grown tired of collecting souls. 5,847 feet of controlled catastrophe. Then silence. The canopy cracked open. Smoke billowed out, thick and dark. And from inside that dying machine, a figure emerged. Major Caitlin Brennan was 32 years old, 5 feet 6 inches of coiled discipline, wrapped in a flight suit that had seen things no pilot should see and lived to tell about. Auburn hair plastered to her skull with sweat. Gray-blue eyes that looked like they'd borrowed their color from the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where she'd been born. Her face was streaked with hydraulic fluid in something darker. She climbed down the ladder with movements that were almost mechanical. 1 rung, 2 rungs. On the third, her legs simply gave up the fight they'd been waging for the last 51 miles. She fell, but someone caught her. Colonel Marcus Dalton was 65 years old and hadn't flown combat in 21 years, but he'd driven across that airbase like a man possessed the moment he saw her approach Vector. His hands, weathered and steady despite the tremor of age and fear, gripped her shoulders, held her upright, held her together. "I did it, Dad," she whispered, and the word came out like a confession. "I brought them home." Dalton's throat worked. His eyes, pale blue and carrying the weight of 3 decades in uniform, glistened with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since 1998. "I know, Kate," he said, voice rough as gravel in a tin cup. "I know." She closed her eyes. A single tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. Then Major Caitlin Brennan, who'd just flown an aircraft that shouldn't exist below altitudes that weren't possible, to save 12 men the world had already written off, did something she never did. She let go. Unconsciousness took her like a mercy. Behind them, Reaper 7 settled onto its broken belly with a final groan of tortured metal. Fuel leaked onto the tarmac. Fire crews swarmed. And somewhere in the depths of that ruined cockpit, on the instrument panel, a pair of dog tags swayed gently in the wind that swept through the open canopy. Engraved on those tags, a name: Griffin Thorne. Among the crowd rushing toward the wreckage was a face Caitlin would have recognized if she'd been conscious. Staff Sergeant James Miller, combat medic, wore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment on his shoulder. 31 years old, married, 2 kids back in Idaho, he got to watch grow up because of a day 4 years ago in a valley called Ganjgal. 23 Marines pinned down by Taliban fire. A sandstorm rolling in. Every aircraft grounded except one. An A-10 had come screaming through weather that should have killed it, flying at an altitude that made meteorologists weep and tacticians resign. The pilot never identified herself, never spoke except to coordinate with the ground team, just delivered 7 minutes of the most precise, close air support Miller had ever seen, then vanished back into the storm. He'd carried that debt for 4 years, never knew the pilot's name, never knew her call sign, until today, when he'd watched her land a dying aircraft and saw the name tape on her flight suit as they loaded her onto the stretcher. Brennan, ghost. "Ma'am," he said quietly to the unconscious woman, "you saved my life once. Guess the universe found a way to balance the books." He stepped back, let the medical team do their work, and made a mental note to find her when she woke up. Some debts you carried until you could say, "Thank you," face to face. But that story, the story of how a woman becomes a ghost and why ghosts fly lower than angels dare, that story began somewhere else entirely. It began 72 hours earlier. It began 35 years before that. It began, like all stories worth telling, with a teacher and a student, and the kind of lesson that only war can write. 72 hours earlier. The clock on her field watch read 0517 hours when Caitlin opened her eyes. 17 minutes before her alarm. She'd been awake for 2 of them, staring at the canvas ceiling of her tent, running through pre-flight checklists in her mind, the way some people count sheep. Outside, Kandahar was beginning its daily resurrection. Generators coughed to life. Boots hit gravel. Someone shouted something about coffee in a voice that suggested they needed it more than they needed salvation. Caitlin sat up, reached for her flight suit, folded with the creases aligned to regulations on the footlocker that served as her only furniture beyond the cot. Her movements were precise, economical, nothing wasted. She'd learned that from her father, Daniel Brennan, who'd worked steel in Pittsburgh until the day the beam fell and made a widow of her mother and an orphan of her childhood. Measure twice, cut once. Think 3 times, act once. Never waste motion, because motion is life, and life is precious. She laced her boots with the same mechanical efficiency. Double knot, tuck the ends, stand, smooth the fabric, check the watch. 0523. Perfect. The walk to the mess hall took 4 minutes. She knew because she'd timed it. Knew which paths to take to avoid the worst of the morning rush, which corners to cut, which shadows to use. Ghost, they called her. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a way of moving through the world, present but not seen, there but not intrusive. She ate oatmeal because it was fuel, drank black coffee because it was tradition, sat alone because it was preference. At 0615 she left. The sun was cresting the mountains to the east, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of amber and threat. Beautiful, if you forgot what hid in those valleys. Easy to forget until the radio crackled and reminded you. Hangar Bay 3 sat at the southern edge of the airfield, a corrugated metal cathedral that housed the kinds of machines that turned fuel and ordnance into foreign policy. Inside, the air tasted of hydraulic fluid and purpose. Her bird waited. Reaper 7, tail number 81-0992, 14 years old, 1,247 combat hours, an A-10 Thunderbolt II that the Marines called Warthog and she called hers. Staff Sergeant Wade Hutchinson was already there, running his pre-flight check with a kind of obsessive attention to detail that separated good crew chiefs from the ones who sent pilots home in boxes. He was 38, from Tennessee, with hands that could strip an engine blindfolded, and a drawl that got thicker when he was worried. "Morning, ma'am," he said, not looking up from the panel he was inspecting. "She's in good shape today. Replaced the hydraulic line in the port stabilizer, topped off the GAU-8. You're sitting at 1174 rounds." 1174, Caitlin repeated, committing it to memory. "What about the left engine temp sensor's been reading hot. I checked it 3 times. It's the sensor, not the engine. Already logged it for replacement, but she'll fly fine." "Good." Hutchinson finally looked up. His eyes, brown and perpetually tired, studied her face for a moment. Whatever he saw there made him reach into his pocket. "Brought you something," he said, pulling out a thermos. "Black, no sugar, like drinking punishment." The corner of Caitlin's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "You making coffee for me now, Wade?" Hell no, ma'am. This is tactical refreshment. There's a difference. He handed it over. Drink it before it gets cold, or before you do something that requires staying awake longer than God intended. She took the thermos, unscrewed the cap. The steam that rose carried the bitter promise of wakefulness. Thanks. Don't thank me yet. You haven't tasted it. She did. It was terrible. It was perfect. They completed the walk-around in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from two people who've done the same dance 100 times and know each other's steps by heart. Check the weapons pods. Inspect the landing gear. Verify the control surfaces. Run your hand along the fuselage and feel for anything that doesn't belong, any rivet that's working loose, any panel that's ready to betray you at altitude. The A-10 was ugly. Everyone said so. It looked like something designed by a committee that hated beauty and loved violence. The engines mounted high on the tail, the cockpit wrapped in a bathtub of titanium armor thick enough to stop 23mm rounds. The nose dominated by a cannon so large and so violent that the aircraft had to be built around it. But to Caitlin, it was beautiful in the way a hammer is beautiful to a carpenter or a scalpel to a surgeon. Form following function until the two became indistinguishable. At 700, the day's mission brief arrived on her tablet. Routine patrol. Grid coordinates in Helmand Province. Show of force. Return by 1400 hours. Routine. She'd learned to distrust that word the same way a sailor learns to distrust a calm sea. But orders were orders, and she was nothing if not a woman who followed orders. It was the one thing that separated her from Griffin, from the memory of Griffin, from the ghost of a man who'd believed the rules were suggestions and paid the price for that belief. At 0745, she climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat that had molded itself to her body over 3 years of flights. Strapped in, helmet on, gloves secure, she reached for the instrument panel, and her fingers brushed against metal that didn't belong to the aircraft. Dog tags. Griffin's dog tags. She kept them there, hung on the angle of attack indicator, where she'd see them on every flight. A reminder, a warning, a talisman against the kind of courage that crosses the line into stupidity. Lieutenant Griffin Thorne, United States Navy, O positive, Protestant, dead at 27 because he thought faster was better and sooner was safer. She touched them once, let the cool metal ground her. Then her hands moved through the startup sequence with the precision of ritual. Master arm safe, battery on, fuel pumps engaged, engine start sequence initiated. The APU spooled up with a whine that built into a roar. The left engine caught, coughed, settled into a steady rumble. The right followed. The cockpit filled with a symphony of systems coming online, each one adding its voice to the chorus. Ready. The tower cleared her for taxi. She released the brakes, and Reaper 7 rolled forward, obedient as an old warhorse that knows the way to battle by heart. She lifted off at 0758, climbing into morning sky that was too beautiful for what was about to happen. The routine patrol took her northwest, over terrain she'd memorized from satellite imagery and personal experience. Brown desert, gray mountains, the occasional green where irrigation brought life to places that had no business sustaining it. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that 73 miles to the north, in a canyon the locals called Devil's Throat, and the maps called grid coordinates that looked like any other grid coordinates, 12 men were about to run out of time and options and ammunition. But somewhere deep in her gut, in the place where instinct lives and training sleeps, she knew something was coming. She could feel it in the way the morning tasted, like copper, like cordite, like fate. 35 years earlier. The story, the real story, began in January 1991. Iraq, Kuwait, the Persian Gulf. Names that would become synonymous with a war that lasted 42 days and changed the face of combat aviation forever. Captain Marcus Dalton was 44 years old in flying his 89th combat mission when everything went wrong. The sky over Basra was black with oil smoke from the retreating Iraqi army, fires that turned day into twilight and made navigation a matter of faith as much as instrumentation. Dalton's F-15E Strike Eagle cut through the smoke at 500 knots. His wingman, Captain Garrett Sullivan, flying formation 300 yards to starboard. The mission was simple: destroy a mobile SAM site that had been harassing coalition aircraft. Get in, get out, get home for the debrief, and the coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a boot. Simple. The radar warning receiver screamed, "SAM launch, multiple targets." "Break right!" Dalton's voice, calm despite the spike of adrenaline that hit his bloodstream like voltage. His hands moved before his conscious mind finished the thought, pulling the stick hard over, punching chaff and flares, the aircraft responding with the violent grace of something designed to dance with death. Sullivan broke left. It was the correct tactical decision. Splitting made them harder targets. Basic fighter doctrine, the kind of thing they drilled 1,000 times in simulators and training ranges in classrooms, where the worst consequence of failure was embarrassment. But simulations don't account for the Iraqi gunner who was 18 years old and terrified and squeezed the second missile's trigger a half-second too early. The missile tracked Sullivan's heat signature. Locked, closed the distance at Mach 3. Dalton saw it happening, saw the smoke trail, saw the geometry of interception writing itself across the sky in vapor and inevitability. He had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision that would echo through the next 35 years of his life. Protocol said, maintain your vector. Don't compromise your own aircraft. Trust your wingman's countermeasures. Protocol said a lot of things. Dalton ignored every single one. He yanked his F-15 into a dive that grayed his vision and stressed the airframe past recommended limits, punched his afterburners, and turned 20 tons of aircraft into a ballistic object with a singular purpose: get between that missile and Garrett Sullivan. He almost made it. The missile's infrared seeker locked onto Dalton's afterburner plume. The missile retargeted, confused by the sudden appearance of a heat source 10 times hotter than the one it had been tracking. It tried to adjust, to compensate, but missiles are fast, and Dalton was faster, and physics doesn't care about intentions. The missile detonated 63 feet from Dalton's tailpipe. Shrapnel tore through the vertical stabilizer. Hydraulic lines ruptured. The right engine flamed out. Warning lights lit up the cockpit like a Christmas tree designed by someone who hated Christmas. But Sullivan's aircraft flew clean, untouched, alive. Dalton nursed his crippled jet back to base on one engine and a prayer, landed with no flaps and minimal control authority, burning through 8,000 feet of runway before the drag chute finally arrested his momentum. They gave him a medal for it: Distinguished Flying Cross, Valor in Combat. The kind of thing that looks good in a display case and feels hollow when you hold it. Because 3 weeks later, Garrett Sullivan's aircraft took ground fire over Baghdad. A lucky shot from a ZSU-23-4, the kind of anti-aircraft weapon the Iraqis had scattered across the country like lethal confetti. The 23-millimeter round punched through the cockpit canopy and turned Sullivan's ejection seat into a malfunction. He went down behind enemy lines. They found him 4 days later in an Iraqi prison, or what was left of him. What hadn't been beaten, what hadn't been broken. The autopsy said heart failure. The photograph said otherwise. And Marcus Dalton, who'd risked everything to save his wingman once, learned the cruelest lesson war has to teach. Sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. Sometimes saving someone's life just means they get to die slower, harder, and farther from home. The Air Force pulled him from combat operations, reassigned him to training command. It was a kindness and a punishment wrapped in the same set of orders. They told him he'd done enough, that he'd earned a rest. What they meant was they didn't trust him anymore, didn't trust that he wouldn't throw himself into the fire again, trying to save someone who couldn't be saved. They were probably right. He took the reassignment without protest, moved to Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas, started teaching young pilots how to fly, how to fight, how to survive. He was good at it. Patient, thorough, the kind of instructor who could break down the most complex maneuver into steps so simple a child could follow them. But he never talked about Garrett Sullivan, never mentioned the medal, never explained why sometimes, in the middle of a lecture about tactical formations or emergency procedures, he'd pause mid-sentence and stare at nothing for 5 seconds that stretched like hours. The students learned not to ask. Then, in 1998, the universe decided Marcus Dalton hadn't suffered enough. His daughter Charlotte was 19 years old, home from her first year at college, when the drunk driver crossed the center line on Highway 90 and turned her future into a statistic. Dead on impact. No time for goodbyes. No time for anything except the sound of metal crumpling and glass breaking, and a father's world ending in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His wife Helen left 6 months later, not out of malice, just out of the simple, terrible truth that sometimes grief is too heavy to carry together, and all you can do is set it down and walk away before it crushes you both. Dalton didn't blame her. He barely noticed. He threw himself into work with the single-minded focus of a man who'd learned that consciousness was the enemy, and exhaustion was the only peace he'd ever know again. He took extra shifts, volunteered for the worst assignments, became the instructor everyone respected and no one really knew. 6 years passed like that, and then one morning in April 2004, a young woman walked into his classroom, and for the first time since Charlotte died, Marcus Dalton felt something other than the crushing weight of absence. Her name tag read, Brennan. She sat in the back row, pulled out a notepad, and waited. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Eyes that didn't flinch when they met his. A face that was pretty enough, but carried itself like beauty was irrelevant, and competence was all that mattered. Dalton looked at her and saw Charlotte. Not the face, they looked nothing alike, but something in the eyes, the set of the shoulders, the way she held herself like she was made of coiled springs and discipline. He looked at her and saw a chance. Not for redemption, he was too old and too tired to believe in redemption, but maybe for something else. Maybe for passing on everything he'd learned, all the lessons written in blood and regret, to someone who might actually survive them. Maybe for teaching someone to fly the way Garrett Sullivan should have flown, the way Charlotte might have lived. He cleared his throat, opened his lecture notes, and began the first class of what would become a relationship that was part instructor-student, part father-daughter, and part something neither of them had words for. "My name is Colonel Marcus Dalton," he said. "I flew 92 combat missions over Iraq and Kuwait. I've seen what happens when you fly angry, when you fly scared, and when you fly stupid. I'm here to make sure you don't do any of those things. I'm here to make sure you come home." His eyes found Brennan in the back row. "I'm here to make sure you all come home." She didn't smile, didn't nod, just maintained eye contact for 1 second longer than necessary, then looked down at her notepad and began writing. Years later, he'd ask her what she wrote in that moment. Her answer, "I wrote down, 'Find out how,' because you look like someone who knew." The training began the next day. Dalton pushed her harder than anyone else in the class, not out of cruelty, but out of the bone-deep certainty that she could take it, could absorb every lesson, every technique, every hard-won piece of wisdom he'd accumulated over 30 years of flying. She learned to read weather patterns by the color of clouds, learned to navigate by stars when GPS failed, learned to fly by feel, by instinct, by the tiny vibrations in the stick that told you when an aircraft was about to stall, or when it had more to give than the instruments suggested. And she learned Dalton's cardinal rule, the one written in Garrett Sullivan's blood: never sacrifice the living for the dead. Think before you act. Calculate before you commit. Discipline over daring. Always. In 2007, During a training exercise at Nevada Test Range, Caitlin earned her call sign. The scenario was simple. Navigate through a mountain valley in zero visibility conditions. Locate a simulated target, return to base. Standard weather navigation test. Except the weather turned from simulated to real when an unexpected cold front collided with desert thermals and turned the sky into a washing machine made of wind and snow. 3 other pilots aborted, returned to base, made the smart, safe, by-the-book decision. Caitlin didn't abort. She dropped to 120 feet, below the worst of the turbulence, and threaded her way through the valley using terrain-following radar and her own sense of where the mountains should be. For 8 minutes, Tower lost her signal. For 8 minutes, Dalton stood in the operations center with his heart trying to punch through his rib cage, certain he was about to watch another person he cared about die. Then she emerged from the weather. Perfect approach, textbook landing. Dalton met her on the tarmac, ready to deliver the most epic chewing out of his career. But before he could speak, her flight lead keyed the radio. Tower, Ghost just flew through conditions that would have killed anyone else. I nominate that as her permanent call sign. Dalton looked at Caitlin, at the woman who just scared 10 years off his life, at the pilot who'd done something impossible and made it look routine. Ghost, he said quietly, because you fly where no one can see you and survive what shouldn't be survivable. She nodded once, accepted it like a burden, like a responsibility, like a name that came with expectations she'd spend the rest of her life trying to meet. That same year, she met Lieutenant Griffin Thorne at Naval Air Station, Oceana. Griffin was everything Caitlin wasn't. Loud where she was quiet, impulsive where she was calculated. He flew F/A-18 Super Hornets with the kind of aggressive confidence that made instructors nervous, and wingmen either admire him or avoid him. 6'2", blonde, blue-eyed, from a Boston family with money older than the Navy itself. He graduated from Annapolis, made Top Gun, and collected admirers the way some people collected stamps. But he was drawn to Caitlin precisely because she wasn't impressed. Because she looked at his swagger and saw through it to something underneath, something lonely, something that needed proving. They dated for 16 months, long enough for Griffin to propose, long enough for Caitlin to say yes, long enough for Dalton to meet Griffin once and come away deeply, profoundly concerned. He flies with his heart, not his head, Dalton told Caitlin over coffee one evening at Laughlin, where she'd come to visit between deployments. He's brave, Caitlin said. Brave and reckless are cousins, Dalton replied, and only one of them comes home. Caitlin looked at her ring. Simple band, nothing flashy. Griffin had wanted to buy her something from Tiffany's. She'd insisted on this instead. I'll keep him grounded, she said. Kate, Dalton said quietly, you can't save someone who doesn't think they need saving. 3 months later, March 15, 2010, proved Dalton right in the worst possible way. Griffin's F-18 squadron was tasked with close air support for an Army Ranger QRF in Helmand Province. 11 soldiers pinned down in a valley, Taliban on the high ground. Standard danger close scenario. Command ordered, hold position, wait for intelligence confirmation. Civilian compound 400 meters south of target. Griffin's last transmission to Caitlin, who was stationed at Kandahar. Kate, they're getting slaughtered. I have clear shot. Griff, stick to ROE. Intel team is verifying targets. Intel takes 15 minutes. They'll be dead in 5. I'm engaging. Griffin, no, wait for... I love you. Watch me save them. Griffin's F-18 dove through 4,500 feet in 8 seconds. Perfect sight picture on the Taliban position. 3 buildings. Muzzle flashes from the rooftops. Rangers pinned in a dry wadi 200 meters south. He fired. The Paveway 2 laser-guided bomb tracked perfectly, hit the center building, penetrated, detonated. What Griffin couldn't see, What the intelligence officer would have told him if he'd waited the 3 minutes for clearance was that the building next door wasn't a residence. It was a fuel depot, diesel for generators, 10,000 gallons. The secondary explosion lit up the valley like a second sun. The shock wave rolled outward at supersonic speed. Griffin's F-18, pulling up from the attack run at 400 knots, flew directly into the expanding fireball. The aircraft didn't explode, it simply came apart. Wings folded, fuselage cracked. Griffin ejected, but the ejection seat's parachute deployment sequence was designed for altitudes above 1,000 feet and airspeeds below 300 knots. He had neither. The chute deployed, tangled. Griffin hit the ground at 70 miles per hour. The Rangers, blinded by the explosion and deafened by the blast, didn't see the Taliban counter-assault coming from the north. Without air cover, without the support Griffin had died trying to provide, they lasted 4 minutes. 11 men, gone. And Griffin, who thought he was saving them, became the reason they died. 8 civilians died in the fuel depot explosion, a family of 5. 3 children playing in the courtyard next door. The investigation was classified. The official report listed mechanical failure. Griffin was buried at Arlington with full honors and a flag Caitlin couldn't bring herself to touch. Dalton flew to Virginia for the funeral, found Caitlin standing alone at the grave after everyone else had left, staring at the fresh earth like it might offer answers. "He died trying to do the right thing," she said without looking up. "He died doing the right thing the wrong way," Dalton replied gently. "There's a difference. If he'd waited, those Rangers might have lived, or they might have died anyway. We'll never know." Dalton put his hand on her shoulder. "But I know this. He flew angry, flew with his heart instead of his head, and that's what killed him. That's what killed 12 people." Caitlin was silent for a long moment. Then she said, voice like stone, "I will never make that mistake. I will think before I act. I will follow protocol. I will save every life I can by being smarter, not braver." "Kate, I'm done talking about him." She walked away, left the grave, left the ring on Griffin's headstone because wearing it felt like carrying the weight of 12 deaths around her neck. Dalton watched her go and felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd wanted to teach her discipline, wanted her to fly smart, but standing there at Griffin Thorne's grave, he wondered if he'd created something too rigid, too controlled. A pilot so bound by rules and protocol that she'd forgotten how to fly by instinct, when instinct was what the situation demanded. 2 years would pass before he'd get his answer. 2 years before a canyon called Devil's Throat would test everything he'd taught her. 2 years before Caitlin would prove that sometimes the only way to save lives is to break every rule except the one that matters most. Come home. The operations center at Kandahar smelled like stale coffee and the particular brand of tension that comes from watching good men die in real time. 0742 hours. August 18th, 2012. Caitlin had been circling her patrol sector for 90 minutes when the emergency transmission cut through her radio like a knife through silence. Talon 6 to base. We are pinned. High ground occupied. Ammunition critical. The voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that only comes when you've accepted what's about to happen and made peace with it. Caitlin banked Reaper 7 southeast toward Kandahar, already calculating fuel for return to base. Standard procedure. RTB, refuel, await orders. The patrol mission was complete anyway. She'd be back on the ground in 23 minutes. Then the second transmission came. Do not attempt rescue. I say again, do not attempt rescue. This canyon is a kill box. This is our last stand. Tell our families. Static swallowed the rest. Caitlin's hand froze on the throttle. 12 men. She didn't know their names, didn't know their faces, but she knew what it sounded like when warriors said goodbye. Ghost 1 to Talon Control, she transmitted. I'm 27 miles from your position. Request permission to divert for reconnaissance. Negative, Ghost 1. Return to base. SAR assets are being scrambled. SAR won't make it in time. Ghost 1, you are ordered to... She switched frequencies, made the decision, banked north. 23 minutes later, she was on the ground at Kandahar, sprinting across the tarmac toward the operations center while Hutchinson scrambled to refuel Reaper 7. She burst through the door into chaos. Lieutenant Colonel David Krause leaned forward over the console, his knuckles white against the metal edge. 42 years old, 2 deployments, a wife back in Georgia who sent care packages filled with beef jerky and paperback novels he never had time to read. He knew what he was hearing, a death rattle. Next to him, Major Sienna Caldwell, 33, SEAL liaison, was pulling up satellite imagery, her face professionally blank in the way that suggested she was screaming on the inside. "That's objective crimson," Caldwell said, her finger tracing the canyon on the screen. "We've designated it no-fly for 6 weeks. Predator went down there in July, just vanished off radar, found the wreckage 3 days later, spread across half a mile of canyon floor." "What took it down?" Krause asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Everything. Crosswinds, turbulence, 3 man-pads teams we counted, probably more we didn't. The canyon walls create a natural funnel. Anything that flies through there is target practice." Caldwell's voice was steady, professional, and completely devoid of hope. "Sir, there's no viable air support option." "What about after dark? Low-altitude insertion?" "By dark, they'll be dead. They've got maybe 30 minutes of ammunition left. Taliban knows it. They're just waiting them out." In the back corner of the room, standing perfectly still in the shadow of a tactical display that showed terrain she'd already memorized during her flight north, Major Caitlin Brennan felt something cold settle in her chest. 12 men. 12 American warriors. She took one step forward, then another. Her boots made no sound on the concrete floor. Ghost, walking among the living while thinking about the dead. Krause closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the screen like staring hard enough might change the topology, might widen the canyon, might erase the enemy positions marked in hostile red across the ridgelines. It didn't. "Get me options," he said quietly. "I don't care how bad they are. Get me something." That's when the door to the operations center opened, and a man walked in who had no business being there. Colonel Marcus Dalton was 65 years old and technically a civilian contractor these days, his role limited to advisory consultation on tactical doctrine, which meant he was supposed to sit in an office and write reports that other people might read if they had time and inclination. He was not supposed to be in the operations center during active missions. He especially was not supposed to be carrying a weathered manila folder that looked like it had survived at least 1 war and possibly 2. Krause looked up. "Colonel Dalton, this is a restricted..." "I know what it is." Dalton's voice carried the rasp of too many years and too many cigarettes he'd quit 20 years ago but could still taste. He walked to the tactical display without asking permission, moving with the deliberate economy of a man who'd learned to conserve energy because you never knew when you'd need it. "I also know that canyon, mapped it myself." Silence. Caldwell exchanged a glance with Krause, the kind of glance that asked questions neither of them wanted to answer. "When?" Krause said finally. 2 years ago, after Lieutenant Thorne went down." Dalton opened the folder. Inside, hand-drawn maps, topographic overlays, wind pattern analyses written in mechanical pencil with the meticulous precision of someone who had nothing but time and everything to prove. "I spent 6 months studying this terrain, every thermal current, every wind shear point, every approach vector that might work." Caitlin felt her breath catch. She'd never known. Never knew that Dalton had spent half a year dissecting the place where Griffin died, trying to understand if there had been another way. "Might," Caldwell repeated. "Respectfully, sir, we need certainties." "Then you're in the wrong business." Dalton spread the maps across the console. His finger traced a line through the canyon, a route that looked less like a flight path and more like a suicide note written in graphite. There's one way in, low altitude, visual flight rules only. You stay below the ridgeline, use the terrain to mask your approach, and you pray the thermals don't flip you into the cliff face. How low? Kraus asked. Below 200 feet, probably below 150 for most of it. The operations center got very quiet. Tech Sergeant Brandon McCoy, 36 years old and operating the drone feeds, spoke up from his station. Sir, that's below minimum safe altitude for... I know what it's below, Dalton cut him off, not unkindly. I'm also telling you it's the only option that doesn't involve watching 12 SEALs die on satellite while we drink coffee and file reports about what we could have done differently. Kraus studied the maps, studied Dalton. His eyes had that 1,000-yard quality of a man doing math he didn't want to do. You're proposing we send an aircraft into a canyon that killed a predator in conditions that violate every safety protocol we have, based on maps that are 2 years old. Yes, that's insane. Yes. Who'd fly it? Dalton turned. His eyes, pale blue and carrying decades of ghosts, found Caitlin standing in the shadow. Found her and held her gaze with the weight of every lesson he'd ever taught, every flight they'd ever briefed, every conversation about the difference between courage and stupidity. She would, Dalton said. Every head in the operations center turned. Caitlin stepped forward into the light. Her face was composed, expressionless, the mask she wore when she was thinking 3 moves ahead and didn't want anyone to know it. She looked at the maps, looked at the satellite imagery, looked at the red markers indicating enemy positions. 37 hostile contacts, minimum, probably more. Manpads confirmed. RPG teams on the high ground. A canyon so narrow the wind itself became a weapon. And 12 men who had maybe 28 minutes left to live. I'll fly it, she said. Kraus opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Major Brennan, you understand what you're volunteering for? Yes, sir. This isn't a request. I'm not ordering you to do this. I'm not even suggesting it. Colonel Dalton's proposal is... Sound, Caitlin interrupted. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel through flesh. Clean, precise. I've flown that terrain in simulation. I know the approach vectors. I know where the thermals break. I know how to read the wind patterns off the canyon walls. Simulation isn't... Griffin didn't wait. The words came out flat, matter of fact, like she was reading a grocery list instead of invoking the name of a dead man whose ring she'd left on a grave 2 years ago. He heard men dying and he went in hot and angry and it got him killed. It got them killed. I won't make that mistake. She walked to the tactical display. Her finger traced Dalton's route, following the pencil line through the canyon like she was reading sheet music and hearing the symphony of violence it would require. I'll fly it cold, by the numbers, every decision calculated, every risk assessed. I'll follow protocol where protocol applies, and I'll improvise where it doesn't. She looked up at Kraus. But I will bring them home. The silence stretched. Kraus looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at McCoy. McCoy looked at his screens like they might offer an answer that flesh and blood couldn't. Finally, Kraus spoke. Prep time? 15 minutes, Caitlin said. Wheels up at 0800. That's 14 minutes now, sir. Kraus breathed out slowly, the kind of breath that carries the weight of decisions you'll think about for the rest of your life, assuming you survive long enough to have regrets. Do it, but Major, you abort at first sign of... Understood. She was already moving toward the door. Dalton caught up to her in the corridor outside, his longer stride eating the distance despite the years that had begun to settle into his joints. Kate, wait! She stopped, turned. I don't have time for a speech, Colonel. Good, because I'm not giving one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 items, held them out in his palm like offerings. Take these. A compass, brass, scratched, the kind that predated GPS by several generations. Dalton's compass, the one he'd carried through 92 missions over Iraq. A photograph, creased, faded, a girl with dark hair in Dalton's eyes, frozen at 19 in her college freshman photo, taken 2 weeks before the accident that ended everything. And a pair of dog tags that Caitlin recognized because she'd seen them every day for 2 years in the place they used to rest against Griffin's chest. She stared at them. The compass for when technology fails, Dalton said quietly. Charlotte's picture to remind you to fly like you're bringing someone's daughter home. His voice cracked on the name, just slightly, just enough. And Griffin's tags to remember what happens when you fly with your heart instead of your head. Caitlin took them. The metal was warm from Dalton's pocket. Warm like they were still alive, still breathing, still possible to save. I taught you everything I know, Dalton continued. Every lesson from the Gulf, every tactic, every technique, every trick that kept me breathing when smarter men died. He paused, met her eyes. Today, I need you to forget all of it. She blinked. Sir? The rule book will get them killed. The safe approach will get them killed. Everything I taught you about measured risk and calculated decisions, today, that gets them killed. His hand came up, gripped her shoulder. Today, you fly like you're saving Charlotte, like you're finishing what Griffin started, like you're proving that impossible is just a word people use when they're too afraid to try. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caitlin nodded once, sharp, decisive. I'll bring them home, Dad. The word hung in the air between them. Dad, not Colonel, not Sir. The word she'd never said out loud, the relationship they'd never named, suddenly made real in the space between mission brief and takeoff. Dalton's eyes glistened. He pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace, let go before either of them could make it awkward. I know you will, he said. Now go. Before I remember, I'm supposed to talk you out of this. She ran. Hangar Bay 3 was organized chaos. Wade Hutchinson had gotten the word and was already swarming over Reaper 7 with his team, double-checking everything, triple-checking the critical systems, moving with the focused intensity of men who knew their pilot was about to do something that would either make history or end it. Caitlin burst through the door at 07:53, 7 minutes to wheels up. Hutchinson looked up from the weapons pod. Ma'am, heard you're flying into hell. Something like that. Well then, he gestured to the GAU-8 cannon nestled in the aircraft's belly, like the tongue of some mechanized god of war. She's loaded with 1174 rounds of PGU-14 armor-piercing incendiary, enough to convince the devil himself to reconsider his life choices. Despite everything, Caitlin felt the corner of her mouth twitch. What about fuel? Topped off, full external tanks. You've got enough gas to loiter for 90 minutes if you fly nice and slow. He paused. You're not going to fly nice and slow, are you? No. Didn't think so. Figured you for more of a fast and terrifying type. He wiped his hands on a rag, then pulled something from his pocket. A thermos. Black coffee, made it strong enough to wake the dead. Figured you might need it. She took it. Their ritual. Thanks, Wade. Don't thank me till you're back on the ground. His expression sobered. Ma'am, I've been working on A-10s for 16 years. Seen them take hits that should have dropped them from the sky. Seen pilots fly birds that were more holes than metal. But what you're about to do, I know. Do you? He looked at her hard. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to fly lower than God intended through a canyon that eats aircraft for breakfast. And I need to know you understand that this time tomorrow, I might be scrubbing your blood out of that cockpit. The hangar went very quiet. Caitlin met his eyes, held them. If I don't come back, it won't be because I didn't try hard enough. It'll be because the universe finally ran out of miracles. She paused. But Wade, I've got 12 reasons to make the universe find one more. Hutchinson studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. stepped back, saluted, which he almost never did, which made it mean something. "Give 'em hell, Ghost." She returned the salute, turned to Reaper 7. The A-10 sat there like a monument to function over form, ugly and beautiful in the way that only things built for a singular purpose can be. The titanium bathtub cockpit, the high-mounted engines designed to run even after taking ground fire, the massive GAU-8 that was less a gun mounted on a plane and more a plane built around a gun. Her bird, her weapon, her responsibility. She climbed the ladder, settled into the seat that knew her body better than most people ever would, began the startup sequence with hands that moved through muscle memory, each switch and button a word in a language she spoke fluently. Battery on, fuel pumps engaged, APU spooling up. On the instrument panel, Griffin's dog tags swayed slightly in the air circulation. She'd hung Dalton's compass next to them. Charlotte's photograph she'd tucked into the top of her flight suit over her heart. The engines caught, left first, then right. The familiar rumble that meant power, meant readiness, meant it was time to stop thinking and start doing. Tower clearance came through. Ghost 1, you are cleared for immediate departure, Vector 27. Weather is clear, winds 1 to 5 knots from the west. Godspeed. Ghost 1 copies, wheels up in 2. She released the brakes. Reaper 7 rolled forward, obedient as always, hungry for the sky like it knew what was coming. She pushed the throttle forward. The engines screamed. The runway blurred. The aircraft lifted, climbing into morning sky that was too beautiful for what was about to happen. Behind her, in the operations center, Dalton watched the radar track representing Ghost 1 climbing to altitude, watched it turn north, watched it head toward a canyon that had killed before and would kill again. Krause stood next to him. "You think she can do it?" Dalton didn't answer immediately. On the screen, Ghost 1's altitude read 8,500 feet. She was 23 minutes from the canyon entrance. "I think," Dalton said slowly, "that I taught her everything I know, and I think that might finally be enough to save someone." His hand came up, touched the screen where her aircraft appeared as a single green blip against the darkness of terrain below. "Come home, Kate," he whispered. "Please, come home." On the screen, Ghost 1 continued north, toward the devil, toward the throat, toward 12 men who didn't know salvation was coming at 500 knots and wearing the call sign of something that didn't exist. The clock read 0802, 21 minutes to contact. Caitlin's voice came through the radio, calm and clear. "Talon 6, this is Ghost 1. I'm 8 miles out. Pop IR strobe on my command." In the canyon, Lieutenant Commander Jackson Whitmore, 35 years old, Alabama native, SEAL Team 6, husband and father of 2, looked at his radio man with something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been trained out of him somewhere around year 3 of special operations. "Did she just say she's inbound?" "Yes, sir." Whitmore looked up at the canyon walls towering 800 feet above their position. Looked at the Taliban fighters he could see moving on the ridgelines, preparing for the final assault. Looked at his team, down to their last magazines, their last grenades, their last minutes. Then he looked at the sky, at the empty, pitiless sky that had offered them nothing but silence since the ambush began. "Tell her," Whitmore said, his voice rough. "Tell her not to come. This canyon is a kill box. Tell her we're already dead." The radio man keyed the mic, started to speak, but before he could transmit, a sound rolled through the canyon like distant thunder. Engines, getting closer. Whitmore's sniper, Petty Officer Caleb Morrison, 29, Iowa farm boy, could shoot the wings off a fly at 800 meters, lowered his rifle, and looked at the sky with an expression of pure disbelief. "Sir," he said quietly, "is that—" "Yes," Whitmore said. The sound grew louder, closer, lower, too low, impossibly low. And then she appeared. The A-10 Thunderbolt came screaming out of the morning sun at an altitude that made no sense. that violated every principle of aviation safety and common sense, flying below the ridgeline, below the enemy positions, so low that the jet wash kicked up dust from the canyon floor. 147 feet above the ground, 340 knots, descending. Corporal Bryn Ashford, 26, Oregon, the team's combat medic, stopped trying to bandage the shrapnel wound on Petty Officer Webb's shoulder and just stared. "Holy Mother of God," she whispered. The A-10 banked hard left, compensating for a crosswind that tried to push it into the cliff face. Compensated perfectly, precisely, like the pilot could see the air itself and knew exactly how to cut through it. Then the cannon opened up. The GAU-8 Avenger is not a subtle weapon. It fires 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second. The sound it makes is distinctive, unique, utterly unmistakable. Brrrt, like God's own zipper being pulled across the fabric of reality. The North Ridge, where 14 Taliban fighters had been preparing to advance, simply ceased to exist as anything recognizable. Rock exploded. Bodies disappeared into pink mist. The RPG teams that had been moving into position became memories and meat. 3 seconds. 195 rounds. An entire enemy position erased. The A-10 pulled up, banked right, disappeared behind the Western Canyon wall. Whitmore and his team sat in shocked silence. "Ghost 1, Whitmore managed finally, his voice shaking. "North Ridge is clear. What the hell did you just do?" Caitlin's voice came back, steady as bedrock. "My job, Talon 6. Stay down, I'm not finished." In the cockpit, Caitlin was already running calculations. Fuel consumption higher than expected due to the low-altitude maneuvering. Thermals stronger than Dalton's maps predicted. Crosswinds variable, gusting, angry. And the enemy wasn't blind anymore. They knew she was here, which meant they'd be ready. She checked her weapons status. 979 rounds remaining. The tactical display showed 2 more major concentrations of hostiles. East Ridge, 11 fighters including Manpad's teams. South Ridge, 8 fighters with heavy weapons. She had a decision to make. The easy tactical choice was to stay high, use standoff weapons, minimize risk to the aircraft. Safe, slow, by the numbers. But safe and slow meant the SEALs stayed pinned. The hard choice was to go lower, faster, closer. She thought about Griffin, who'd made the hard choice for the wrong reasons, and died for it. She thought about Dalton, who'd made the hard choice for the right reasons, and lived with it. She thought about Charlotte, who never got to make any choice at all. Then Caitlin stopped thinking and started flying. She dove. The altimeter unwound like a stopwatch counting down to impact. 140, 120, 100, 90. Warnings screamed. The terrain proximity alert was having a nervous breakdown. She silenced it with a switch flip and kept descending. 80 feet. The canyon walls became blurs of gray and brown. Trees resolved into individual branches. She could see rocks, could see the dried riverbed, could see exactly how small the margin for error had become. 73 feet above the ground, flying at 360 knots, in a canyon 380 feet wide. Behind her, in the operations center, every alarm Dalton's experience had ever learned to fear was going off in his head. He watched the altimeter reading and felt his heart trying to climb out of his chest. "Kate," he said into the radio, knowing she probably couldn't hear him over the mission frequency. "Kate, that's too low. Pull up, please pull up." She didn't pull up. She dropped lower, 67 feet, and then she saw it. The East Ridge, the Manpads teams, 2 of them, shoulder-mounted surface-to-air missiles, designed specifically to kill aircraft exactly like hers. On the eastern ridge, hidden in a cave entrance carved by centuries of wind, Hamza Kadir lowered his binoculars with hands that had forgotten how to shake. He was 51 years old, had fought the Soviets in the 80s when he was young enough to believe in causes, had killed his first American in 2003. his 37th last month. He'd learned to read the patterns of their aircraft, the altitudes they preferred, the tactics that kept them safe and predictable. This pilot was neither safe nor predictable. She flew like the Russian Hind pilots had flown in the Panjshir Valley. Low, aggressive, with the kind of precision that came from skill married to desperation. "Commander," his lieutenant said beside him, voice tight with fear, "the Americans have never—" "I know," Kadir cut him off. His son had died in a drone strike in 2009. Clinical, distant, missiles from the sky that gave no warning and showed no mercy. This was different. This was personal. This pilot was looking him in the eye and daring him to blink. He watched the A-10 drop lower, impossibly lower, and felt something he hadn't felt since the Soviets left. Respect for an enemy. "Fire the Strelas," he said quietly. "If she's brave enough to fly that low, let's see if she's skilled enough to survive it." The Manpads teams tracked Caitlin. She could see the gunners adjusting their aim, leading her flight path, waiting for the lock tone. She had maybe 4 seconds before they fired. Griffin had hesitated, had second-guessed, had died thinking about what might happen instead of forcing what needed to happen. Caitlin didn't hesitate. She dropped to 62 feet and accelerated to 420 knots. The Manpads fired, 2 smoke trails corkscrewing up from the ridge, heat seekers trying to acquire lock on engines that were suddenly too close to the ground, too mixed with the thermal signature of rock and earth and wind. The missile's guidance systems faltered, confused, couldn't distinguish target from terrain. And Caitlin, flying lower than missiles were designed to track, faster than human reaction time could follow, opened up with the GAU-8 again. The East Ridge erupted. 11 fighters, 2 Manpads teams, gone in a storm of 30-millimeter fury that lasted 4 seconds and consumed 300 rounds. Kadir's cave entrance collapsed. He survived, buried under rubble, listening to the sound of American engines fade into the distance. He would be dug out 3 days later by local fighters, would surrender to Afghan forces a week after that, would ask in interrogation to meet the pilot who flew like a ghost. They would tell him, no. Some ghosts are better left alone. The missiles, leaderless, lost lock completely. One spiraled into the canyon wall. The other flew straight up until its fuel ran out, and it fell back to Earth like a very expensive, very stupid rock. Caitlin pulled up hard, her vision graying at the edges from the G-forces, and cleared the canyon rim with maybe 15 feet to spare. On the ground, Whitmore's team was running, 700 meters to the extraction point, double time, carrying their wounded. Ashford had Webb in a fireman's carry. Morrison was providing cover. The rest of the team was moving like their lives depended on it, which they did. From a cave entrance on the western slope, a technical truck rolled into view. Toyota Hilux, mounted DSK heavy machine gun. The truck's gunner opened up, 12.7-millimeter rounds chewing up the ground around the running SEALs. Morrison went down. Not hit, just diving for cover. The formation broke, scattered. In her cockpit, Caitlin saw it happening, saw the truck, saw her people pinned again. She was out of position, too high, wrong angle. The smart play was to come around, set up properly, engage from a stable firing position. The smart play would take 45 seconds. So Caitlin did something that wasn't smart. She rolled inverted, pulled the nose down past vertical, and dove back into the canyon, straight down. At 900 feet above the canyon floor, she rolled upright. At 600 feet, she leveled out. At 300 feet, she fired. The Maverick missile leapt from the wing pylon, rocket motor igniting. The technical truck disappeared in a fireball that painted the canyon wall orange. Caitlin pulled up again, harder this time, the aircraft groaning, metal complaining, but holding together. She cleared the canyon rim, leveled out at 2,000 feet, and that's when her left engine exploded. Not figuratively, literally. A catastrophic compressor failure, probably from debris ingestion, possibly from pushing the engine past every limitation it was ever designed to handle. The explosion was violent, metal shredding, fire blooming, warning lights cascading across her panel. Left engine fire, left hydraulic failure, left fuel tank breach. She hit the fire suppression, shut down the left engine, activated the emergency hydraulic pump. The aircraft yawed hard left. She compensated with right rudder, fighting the asymmetric thrust. Ghost 1, this is Talon Control, Krause's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. We're showing left engine failure. Say your status. Left engine shut down. Flying on right engine only. Hydraulics degraded. Still operational. Ghost 1, you need to. Negative, Talon. Mission incomplete. Still have targets. Because she did. The South Ridge. 8 fighters. Still in position. Still capable of interdicting the SEAL team's movement. Major Brennan, Dalton's voice cut in, and it wasn't Colonel talking to pilot anymore. It was father talking to daughter. Kate, you've done enough. Come home. She looked at her fuel gauge, looked at her hydraulic pressure, looked at the temperature reading on her remaining engine, looked at the tactical display showing 12 dots moving toward extraction and 8 hostile dots that could still stop them. Not yet, she said quietly. Not yet, Dad. She banked right on one engine and went back into the canyon. One more time. The GAU-8 had 679 rounds remaining. She used 240 of them. 4 seconds of concentrated violence, delivered at a rate that turned the South Ridge into a landscape of dust and ruin. When she pulled up and away, the South Ridge was silent. Ghost 1, Dalton said into the radio. South Ridge is clear. The SEALs are moving to LZ. Chinooks are 2 minutes out. You've done it. Now get out of there before that bird falls apart. Caitlin checked her instruments. Fuel at 28% and dropping. Right engine temperature at 930 degrees Celsius. Hydraulic pressure at 41%. Distance to Kandahar, 51 nautical miles. She did the math. At her current fuel consumption rate, she had maybe 12 minutes of flight time. Kandahar was 18 minutes away, which meant she wasn't making it home. The smart play was to eject. She looked at the dog tags, at Charlotte's photograph, at Dalton's compass. Then she keyed her mic. Negative on the eject, Talon. I'm bringing this bird home. Behind her, the 2 Chinooks swept into the canyon. The SEALs were at the LZ. Smoke grenades popped, purple smoke marking salvation. The loadmaster's voice. Talon 6, this is Eagle 1. We have visual. 30 seconds to touchdown. Copy, Eagle 1. Be advised. Still taking sporadic. The transmission cut off in static and gunfire. Caitlin's radar painted a contact that made her blood freeze. Heat signature. Moving fast. Missile launch. Someone had held a man-pads in reserve, waiting for the rescue birds. The Chinook had 6 crew and was about to load 12 SEALs. 18 souls. 18 people who would die in 8 seconds unless someone did something. Caitlin didn't think, didn't hesitate, she just acted. Pushed the throttle to emergency power, rolled the aircraft 90 degrees, dove, straight at the missile. In the operations center, someone made a sound that wasn't quite a scream. Dalton closed his eyes, opened them, watched. The missile saw Caitlin's aircraft, saw the heat signature, locked on. 6 seconds to impact. At 3 seconds, she killed the engine, just shut it down, cut fuel flow, turned her heat signature from bonfire to embers. The missile searched, failed. At 2 seconds, Caitlin deployed her last flare. The flare burned white hot, magnesium and lies. The missile retargeted, chased the flare, detonated 26 feet from Caitlin's tail section. The shockwave hit. Shrapnel tore through the vertical stabilizer, the rudder, the tail section. The aircraft lurched, yawed, started to spin. Caitlin fought it, hands on the stick, feet on the pedals. The spin tightened. The world became a blur. She was inverted, then upright, then inverted again. Altitude unwinding. 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. She gripped the stick with both hands, pulled, felt something tear in her shoulder. The nose came up, slowly. The spin damped, slowed, stopped. She was flying level at 700 feet with no engine, no tail control, and hydraulics that had given up. A glider. Dalton's voice in her headset, rough with emotion. "Kate, please, eject. You've done enough. Come home." She looked at her fuel gauge, empty. Looked at her altitude, 650 feet and descending. Looked at the distance to Kandahar, 42 miles. "I am coming home, Dad," she said quietly. "I'm bringing your bird home." She trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed, 120 knots. The desert floor passed beneath her, rocks and sand. 500 feet, 38 miles to go. 400 feet, 34 miles. She was losing altitude faster than she was covering distance. At 300 feet, Wade Hutchinson's voice came through. "Ma'am, I can see you on approach. Towers cleared the runway. Foam is down. We're all ready. Just bring her in." "Copy," she said. "Might be a firm landing, Wade. Ma'am, you could crash that bird through the tower and I'd still buy you a beer after." 200 feet, 10 miles out. The airbase was visible now. 150 feet, 5 miles. She wasn't going to make it. The glide ratio was wrong. Unless she pulled the nose up, traded speed for altitude, felt the aircraft balloon upward. 180 feet. Airspeed dropping, 110 knots, 190. The runway was right there. 3 miles, 80 knots. Below stall speed, the aircraft was flying on stubbornness. 75 knots. The nose dropped. The aircraft had run out of energy. She was at 120 feet, 1 mile from the runway, and falling. She pulled the manual landing gear release. Felt the gear drop and lock. Pulled back on the stick one more time, not to climb, just to flare. The main gear hit first, touched the runway threshold so hard that the right tire exploded instantly. The aircraft bounced, slammed down again, the nose gear collapsed. Reaper 7 hit the concrete on its belly and began to slide. Metal on concrete, sparks showering. 5,847 feet down the runway, the aircraft stopped. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the canopy opened. Smoke poured out, and through it, a figure emerged. Caitlin climbed down the ladder. Her legs were shaking, her shoulder torn, her hands cramping. On the third rung, her legs quit. But Dalton was there, caught her, held her. She collapsed into his arms. "I did it," she whispered. "I brought them home. All of them." Dalton's voice broke. "I know, sweetheart, I know." Behind them, the Chinooks were landing. The SEALs were climbing out, dirty and bloody and alive. All 12 of them, whole. The medical team loaded Caitlin onto a stretcher, started an IV, put an oxygen mask over her face. As they carried her toward the medical tent, she looked back at Reaper 7. At the broken bird that had refused to fall. "Thank you," she whispered. The aircraft didn't answer. It was just metal and hydraulics and systems that had failed. But for 23 minutes over the Devil's Throat, it had been something more. It had been hope with wings. Hutchinson approached the wreckage, tablet in hand, cataloging the damage. Left wing, destroyed. Tail section, 60% gone. Fuselage, cracked in 3 places. Right engine, melted. The aircraft would never fly again, but it had done its job. It had brought its pilot home. 48 hours later, Caitlin sat in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, arm in a sling, shoulder repaired, body recovering faster than her mind. The concussion was mild. The muscle tear would heal. The bruises would fade. The video conference call from the Pentagon would not. General Patricia Vance appeared on the screen, her expression carefully neutral. Next to her, Major General Theodore Carver and a JAG officer. Major Brennan, Vance began, we've reviewed the mission footage. All of it. Caitlin waited. You violated 19 separate safety protocols, exceeded aircraft limitations 47 times, flew below minimum safe altitude in a combat zone, engaged without authorization, destroyed a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Yes, ma'am. And you saved 12 American lives in the process. Yes, ma'am. Vance leaned forward. Off the record, Major, why didn't you eject? You had multiple opportunities. Caitlin thought about Griffin, about the choice he'd made to act without thinking. She thought about Dalton, about the choice he'd made to save Garrett Sullivan. She thought about herself, about the choice she'd made to fly by the numbers, to think before acting. Because, ma'am, I promised Colonel Dalton I'd bring his bird home, and I keep my promises. Vance studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. The board has made a decision. You're being grounded, pending safety review. Caitlin's heart sank. However, Vance continued, the Air Force is also authorizing a new training program, Advanced Close Air Support Tactics Initiative. We need someone to run it, someone who can teach the next generation of CAS pilots how to push the envelope without tearing it. She paused. Colonel Dalton has agreed to come out of retirement as co-director, but the program needs a lead instructor, someone who's actually flown the missions, done the impossible. Vance's eyes locked on Caitlin. The job's yours if you want it. You'd be based at Nellis. Start in 6 months after you've recovered. Caitlin blinked. Ma'am, you can say no. Go back to flying combat. We'll find someone else for the program. But Major, you've just rewritten the tactical manual for low-altitude CAS. The question is whether you want to keep that knowledge to yourself or pass it on. The choice was simple. I accept, Caitlin said. 3 months later, Kandahar held a ceremony. Not official, not Pentagon approved, just the people who'd been there. Lieutenant Commander Jackson Whitmore stood in Hangar Bay 3, his team assembled behind him. Whitmore approached Caitlin, who stood in her dress uniform, arm still in a sling, and held out a small wooden box. Major Brennan, he said formally, on behalf of SEAL Team Talon 6, we'd like to present you with this. She opened the box. Inside, a Navy SEAL trident. Gold. Beautiful. You're not a SEAL, Whitmore continued, but you have our respect, our gratitude, our brotherhood. Forever. He pinned it to her uniform, stepped back, saluted. Behind him, all 12 SEALs saluted. Caitlin returned it, her throat tight. Corporal Bryn Ashford stepped forward next, a young girl holding her hand. 6 years old, dark hair, shy smile. Ma'am, Ashford said quietly, this is my daughter Lily. She's here because of you, because you gave me the chance to be her mother. The little girl held out a piece of paper, a drawing in crayon, an A-10 warthog with angel wings flying through clouds. Caitlin took it, looked at it, felt something break in her chest and start to heal. Thank you, she whispered. That evening, Dalton found her on the tarmac, standing where Reaper 7 had been. The wreckage had been cleared away. All that remained was an oil stain on the concrete and the memory. You did good, Kate, Dalton said quietly. I got lucky. Luck is what happens when skill meets opportunity. He paused. You know why I pushed you so hard, all these years? Because I reminded you of Charlotte. No, he shook his head. Because you were better than Charlotte could have been. Better than Garrett. Better than me. You had the courage without the recklessness, the discipline without the rigidity. You were the pilot I tried to be and never quite managed. He put his hand on her shoulder. The good one. You proved something that day. That impossible just means nobody's figured out how yet. That the rules serve us, not the other way around. That sometimes the only way to save people is to risk everything. Caitlin looked at the empty space where her aircraft had been. Griffin tried to save people by risking everything, she said. It killed him. Because he flew with his heart instead of his head. You flew with both. Dalton smiled, sad and proud. That's the difference between a hero and a martyr, Kate. Heroes come home. They stood in silence, watching the sunset over the Hindu Kush. Come on, Dalton said finally. We've got a training program to build, students to teach, legacy to pass on. Dad, Caitlin said, do you think they'll listen? The next generation? They'll listen, he said, because you'll tell them the truth. That flying isn't about the aircraft or the mission or the medals. It's about the people on the ground who need you to be better than possible. He started walking. Caitlin took one last look at the empty tarmac, at the place where Reaper 7 had touched down and refused to die until its pilot was safe. Then she followed Dalton into the building, into the future, into the work of teaching others how to become ghosts. 5 years later, Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, the sun hung high and merciless over the USAF Weapons School. Lieutenant Colonel Caitlin Brennan stood at the front of a classroom containing 20 new A-10 pilots. In the back row, Colonel Marcus Dalton sat quietly, 70 years old now, officially retired again but present as co-director emeritus. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, Caitlin said. Before we begin, I need to know something. How many of you have heard of the Devil's Throat? Every hand went up. Good. How many of you think you could fly it? The hands stayed up. Confident. Certain. Caitlin smiled, not kindly. Then I'm going to teach you 3 things. First, confidence gets you killed. Second, the aircraft doesn't care about your feelings. Third, the only mission that matters is bringing everyone home. She paused. Including yourself. One of the students raised her hand. Young, 24, dark hair, familiar eyes. Ma'am, I have a question. Go ahead. My brother was Lieutenant Griffin Thorne. He died trying to save people in Helmand Province. The young woman's voice was steady. I want to learn to finish what he started, the right way. Caitlin felt the world stop. She looked at the student's name tape. Thorne, S. Sloan. Griffin's sister. For a moment, Caitlin couldn't speak. Then she found her voice. Your brother was one of the bravest pilots I've ever known, she said quietly. He was also someone I loved, someone I was going to marry. The classroom went silent. He died because he confused courage with haste, because he thought saving people meant throwing yourself at the problem without thinking it through. Caitlin walked toward Sloan's desk. I'm going to teach you to be better than he was, smarter, more disciplined. I'm going to teach you to honor his memory by learning from his mistakes. She met Sloan's eyes. And when you graduate, you're going to save people the way he wanted to, but didn't know how. By thinking before you act, by calculating before you commit, by being the pilot he could have been if he'd lived long enough to learn. Sloan nodded, tears on her face. Yes, ma'am. Caitlin touched her shoulder once, brief, understanding. Then she returned to the front of the classroom. The first rule of advanced combat tactics, she said, is that the mission defines your altitude, not your fear. The second rule is that you trust your training over your instincts. The third rule is that you never leave anyone behind, but you also never throw yourself away. She pulled up a tactical display, the Devil's Throat. Today we're going to study a mission that violated every safety protocol in the book, that pushed aircraft and pilot past every reasonable limitation. That succeeded because someone decided impossible just meant nobody had figured out how yet. The students leaned forward. From the back of the room, Dalton smiled. 6 months later, graduation day, the class filed out to the flight line where 6 A-10s waited. Caitlin led them in formation into Devil's Gate Canyon, the Nevada training range that mimicked Helmand Province. Her voice came through their headsets, calm and clear. Remember, you're not flying machines. You're flying purpose. When the world says impossible, you show them how. When they tell you to pull up, you evaluate whether pulling up saves lives or just saves face. When they tell you it can't be done, you do the math and prove them wrong. The aircraft dove into the canyon. 6 machines, 6 pilots, One lesson being passed from one generation to the next. After the training flight, Caitlin stood in front of the memorial wall outside the weapons school. 3 plaques, bronze on black marble. The first, Lieutenant Griffin Thorne, USN, Courage Beyond Measure, 1983 to 2010. The second, a 10C Reaper 7, Tail 81-0992, The Bird That Refused to Fall. Last flight, August 18, 2012. The third, Colonel Marcus Dalton, USAF, teacher, father, legend. The Sky Remembers. Dalton had passed 3 months ago, peacefully, in his sleep. His last words, according to the nurse, were simple. "Tell Kate she made me proud." But Caitlin hadn't been there to hear them. She'd been teaching a class on emergency procedures when the call came, had finished the lesson, because that's what Dalton would have wanted, before driving to the hospital. She'd arrived to find him already gone, his face peaceful in a way it never had been in life. On the bedside table, a note in his handwriting, shaky but legible. "Kate, you made an old man believe in second chances. Fly safe, fly smart, and when the time comes, fly home. Dad." She'd folded that note and placed it next to Griffin's dog tags, next to Charlotte's photo, next to the compass that had guided her through the devil's throat. Some debts you never finish paying. Some gifts you carry forever. Caitlin touched all 3 plaques, bronze warm under her fingers. Behind her, footsteps. Sloane Thorne, newly graduated, wearing her wings, carrying her orders to her first combat squadron. "Ma'am," Sloane said quietly, "I'm heading to Kandahar next month." "I know. I'll be flying the same routes, maybe even the same canyon." "I know that too." Sloane hesitated. "What if I'm not ready? What if I fail? What if I'm not as good as you or as brave as Griffin?" Caitlin turned to face her, saw Griffin in the eyes, saw Charlotte in the set of her shoulders, saw herself, years ago, wondering if she'd ever be good enough. "You don't need to be as good as me," Caitlin said. "You need to be better. You don't need to be as brave as Griffin. You need to be smarter. You don't fly to prove anything to anyone. You fly to bring people home." She smiled. "Including yourself." Sloane nodded, saluted, turned to leave. "Lieutenant," Caitlin called. Sloane turned back. "When you get to Kandahar, look for Master Sergeant Wade Hutchinson. He's been taking care of warthogs and their pilots for 22 years now. Tell him Ghost sent you. He'll know what that means." "Yes, ma'am." Sloane walked away, toward her future, toward her war, toward the moment when she'd have to make the choice between the rule book and the lives that needed saving. Caitlin watched her go. Then she looked up at the sky, clear and blue and infinite. Somewhere up there Dalton was flying, and Charlotte, and Griffin, and all the others who'd traded altitude for impact. "I kept my promise, Dad," she whispered. "I taught them, all of them, how to fly like you, how to think like me, how to come home." The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of jet engines. The next generation, learning to dance with death. Learning that ghosts don't just haunt the sky, sometimes they save it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very skilled and very, very brave, they teach you how to save it too. The sky remembers. The sky always remembers.